My name is Amber Hayes, and at 27, I never imagined I'd be counting quarters by flashlight in a Walmart parking lot at 2 a.m. 3 months living in my Honda Civic feels like 3 years. My back aches from double shifts at the diner and convenience store, but it beats going back to them. The rain drums harder on my roof as I count again, $2,743 saved, still not enough. Nobody knows I sleep in my car, not even my coworkers. I just need to stay invisible until I can afford an apartment. Headlights suddenly blind me as an expensive car pulls up beside mine. The window rolls down, revealing a face I haven't seen in years, Uncle Lawrence. My stomach drops. How do I hide this? Before I get into my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If my situation sounds familiar or you've ever faced similar struggles, hit that like button. This journey gets intense, so subscribe to follow along as I reveal how my life completely transformed in ways I never expected. Living in your car isn't something you plan for. It's something that happens gradually, then suddenly. My daily routine had become a carefully orchestrated performance of normalcy while hiding my reality. Every morning began at 5 a.m. when I'd wake up curled in the reclined driver's seat of my 12-year-old Honda Civic, usually parked in the far corner of a different Walmart parking lot each night. I rotated between 3 locations to avoid security becoming suspicious. The car was cramped but organized, my clothes neatly folded in the trunk, toiletries in a shower caddy, a small cooler with basics like peanut butter and bread wedged behind the passenger seat. I'd drive to Planet Fitness. The $10 monthly membership was my lifeline for showers. I kept it even when I could barely afford gas. 20 minutes to wash, brush my teeth, and make myself look presentable enough for work. I'd developed a system. Shower quickly, dry my hair with paper towels to save time, apply minimal makeup to look put together but not enough to seem like I was trying too hard. No one could know. By 5:45 a.m., I'd be in the parking lot of Sunrise Diner, preparing for my 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. shift as a waitress. The morning regulars never suspected I'd slept in my car just hours earlier. I smiled through exhaustion, memorized their orders, and collected tips that went straight into my savings. My manager, Doris, thought I was just an early bird with a strong work ethic. Between shifts, I'd sit in my car at the public library parking lot, changing clothes, and eating whatever I could afford, usually something cheap from the diner's employee discount menu. Sometimes I'd nap for 30 minutes, setting multiple alarms so I wouldn't be late for my second job. From 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., I worked at Quick Stop convenience store, standing behind a counter selling lottery tickets and cigarettes to people who barely looked at me. The night manager, Greg, thought I was saving for graduate school. It wasn't entirely a lie. I was saving, just not for education. After my night shift ended, I'd drive around looking for a safe place to park and sleep. I'd learned which spots were relatively safe, which had bathroom access nearby, and which would likely get me a knock from security or police. The fear of being discovered never quite went away, even when I was too exhausted to keep my eyes open. Uncle Lawrence had once been a constant in my life, before everything fell apart. My mother's older brother, he'd made his fortune in tech investments in the early 2000s. When I was young, he'd visit often, bringing books and taking me to museums when my mom was still alive. He was the one who encouraged my interest in science, who told me I could be anything I wanted. But after Mom died of cancer when I was 15, everything changed. Dad remarried barely a year later to Diane, a woman with 2 children of her own. Trevor and Megan, both older than me. Uncle Lawrence tried to stay involved in my life, but Diane had her own ideas about family. She was subtle at first, forgetting to tell me when he called, scheduling family events when he was out of town, making comments about how he thought he was better than everyone else because of his money. Dad, lost in grief and desperate for companionship, never noticed or chose not to. Gradually, the visits from Uncle Lawrence became phone calls, then occasional emails, then birthday cards, and finally, nothing. The last time I'd seen him was at my high school graduation 8 years ago. Diane had made sure he was seated far from the family, and the brief conversation we managed to have was overshadowed by her constant interruptions. After that, contact stopped entirely. I assumed he'd given up on me like everyone else eventually did. My financial situation was precarious at best. The $2,743 I'd managed to save was nowhere near enough for what I needed. Apartment hunting had shown me the harsh reality. Even the most rundown studios required first and last month's rent plus security deposit, easily $5,000 total. And that was assuming they'd even rent to me with my credit score. My credit had been destroyed 2 years ago when Trevor somehow got access to my information and opened credit cards in my name. When I discovered the fraud and confronted him, Diane convinced my father it was a misunderstanding and that I was being dramatic. The accounts went unpaid, and my credit score plummeted. I couldn't even get approved for a secured credit card now. Every day was a careful balancing act between saving every possible penny and meeting basic needs. I had calculated exactly how much gas I needed to get between my jobs and sleeping locations. I knew which fast food places had the most filling dollar menu items. I'd become an expert at finding public restrooms and free Wi-Fi. The library had become my sanctuary on my rare days off. Warm in winter, cool in summer, and no one questioned you for sitting in one spot for hours. What hurt most was having no safety net. No one to call when the check engine light came on in my car. No one to help when I got food poisoning and still had to work both shifts because missing a day meant not making rent. No one who even knew what was happening to me. I had cut ties with the few friends I'd managed to keep after high school, too ashamed to admit how bad things had gotten. Isolation was the price of freedom from my stepfamily's abuse, and most days, it seemed worth it. But on nights like tonight, with rain pounding my car roof and Uncle Lawrence's unexpected appearance threatening the fragile stability I'd created, I wasn't so sure anymore. The rhythmic tapping of rain against my windshield often triggered memories I tried to keep buried. Tonight was no exception, especially with Uncle Lawrence's sudden reappearance bringing the past rushing back. It hadn't always been obvious that I needed to escape. The abuse in my stepfamily was insidious, building so gradually that for years, I doubted my own perception. It began after the funeral, when the initial sympathy for poor motherless Amber had worn off. Dad retreated into himself, working longer hours, leaving me alone with Diane and her children in what had once been my safe home. I remembered the first time I realized something was wrong. I was 16, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when Diane served dinner. A plate for my father, his favorite roast beef. Plates for Trevor and Megan, the same. For me, leftover spaghetti from 2 nights before. When I asked why, she smiled sweetly and said, "I just thought you'd prefer this, honey. You always loved your mother's spaghetti, didn't you?" My father, distracted as always, never noticed the discrepancy. That was how it always worked, small cruelties disguised as thoughtfulness, always with plausible deniability. Diane was a master of gaslighting before I even knew the term. When I couldn't find my belongings, she'd suggest I was becoming forgetful like your mother. When I achieved something at school, she'd praise Trevor and Megan's accomplishments instead, making mine seem insignificant by comparison. Trevor, 3 years older, quickly learned from his mother. He began borrowing my things without asking, returning them damaged or not at all. When I complained, Dad would tell me to share with my brother. Trevor wasn't my brother, he made that clear when no adults were around. "Your mom's dead, and your dad wishes you were too so he could just be with us," he told me once when I asked him to return my laptop. Megan's methods were more social. At school, she spread rumors that I was unstable after my mother's death. She'd invite friends over and make a show of whispering about me, stopping when I entered rooms. When I tried to make my own friends, she'd somehow charm them away. By senior year, I was effectively isolated, eating lunch alone and coming home to more of the same. The financial abuse started small. Diane convinced my father that I should learn responsibility by getting a part-time job at 17. This seemed reasonable enough until I realized neither Trevor nor Megan had to work. My entire paycheck was expected to go toward household expenses and my share, while they received allowances. Dad became an enforcer without realizing it. If I questioned anything, Diane would wait until we were alone, then tell him I was being disrespectful to her. By the time I got home from school, he'd be ready with a lecture about respecting my stepmother and being grateful for all she did for me. The pattern repeated so often that eventually I stopped defending myself. The breaking point came during my second year of community college. I'd been working full-time while taking classes, saving what little I could hide from Diane's household contribution requirements. One day, I went to check my college fund, a small account my mother had set up before she died, to pay for the next semester's tuition. It was empty. The bank confirmed that the account had been emptied 6 months earlier. Joint access had somehow been granted to my father, who had withdrawn everything. When I confronted him, he seemed genuinely confused, then defensive. "Diane said you agreed to use that money for household expenses since you're an adult now," he insisted. I had never agreed to any such thing. When I tried to explain this, Diane appeared, tearfully claiming I had indeed agreed but was now changing my story to cause trouble. "She's been so angry since we became a family, Richard," she told my father. "Nothing we do is ever enough." That night, I searched through Diane's home office while everyone was asleep and found bank statements showing transfers from my college fund into their joint account, followed by payments for Trevor's car and Megan's spring break trip to Cancun. I took photos as evidence, my hands shaking with rage and disbelief. The confrontation that followed was explosive. I showed my father the evidence, expecting him to finally see the truth. Instead, he accused me of snooping and betraying the family's trust. Diane played the victim masterfully, crying about how hard she'd tried to be a mother to me. Trevor smirked from the doorway while Megan pretended to console her mother. "Your mother would be ashamed of who you've become," my father said, words that cut deeper than any physical blow could have. "My mother would be ashamed of who you've become," I responded, finally finding my voice after years of silence. His face hardened. "You have a choice, Amber. Accept your place in this family or leave." In that moment, the decision was clear. "That's not much of a choice," I said, already mentally cataloging what I would take with me. I left that night with a backpack of essentials and $230 to my name. I had no plan beyond escaping, no destination in mind. I stayed with a coworker for 2 weeks until I felt I was imposing too much, then moved to a motel until the money ran out. After that came the car. 3 months of living like this had taught me more about survival than the previous 8 years with my stepfamily. But seeing Uncle Lawrence tonight made all those carefully buried memories resurface. He represented the last connection to my life before everything fell apart, before I became a person who counted laundromat quarters and knew which public bathrooms were cleanest at 2 a.m. I wasn't ready for him to see what I had become. I wasn't ready for anyone to know. The moment Uncle Lawrence's eyes met mine through our car windows, panic surged through me. I scrambled to push my pillow and blanket behind the seat, shoved my toiletry bag under a jacket, and tried to smooth my hair. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat as he stepped out of his Mercedes and approached my car. Rain pattered against his umbrella as he leaned down to my window, which I reluctantly rolled down a few inches. His face had more lines than I remembered, silver threading through his once dark hair, but his eyes were the same, kind, perceptive, and now, filled with surprise. "Amber? Is that really you?" His voice held genuine warmth that made my eyes sting with unexpected tears. "Uncle Lawrence," I managed, trying to sound casual. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," he said, glancing around the nearly empty parking lot. "I was meeting with a client at the restaurant across the street." He paused, studying my face. "It's been, 8 years? You look so much like your mother." The comparison to Mom made my throat tighten. I forced a smile, hoping he couldn't see how thin I'd become, how exhausted I was. "Yeah, it's been a while." A car drove by, illuminating the interior of my Honda briefly. I saw his eyes flick to the stacked bags in my back seat, the travel toothbrush in my cup holder I'd forgotten to hide. "Are you okay, Amber?" he asked, his tone shifting to concern. I'm fine, I said too quickly. Just stopped to check my phone before heading home. His expression told me he didn't believe me, but he didn't push. Instead, he said, I'd love to catch up. Are you free for dinner? My treat. Every instinct told me to refuse, to protect my secret, but something in his genuine interest broke through my defenses. Plus, the prospect of a real meal that didn't come from a dollar menu was too tempting. I guess I could do dinner, I said hesitantly. He suggested Castellano's, an upscale Italian restaurant I'd passed many times but never entered. I followed his Mercedes in my weathered Honda, painfully aware of the contrast between our vehicles. In the restaurant parking lot, I checked my appearance in the rearview mirror, dark circles under my eyes, hair flat from the humidity, wearing my nicer uniform shirt from the diner because I hadn't had time to change after my shift. The restaurant host barely concealed his judgment at my appearance as Uncle Lawrence requested a quiet table. I felt painfully out of place among the well-dressed patrons, the pristine white tablecloths, the multiple forks and spoons at each setting. Uncle Lawrence, however, treated me like I belonged, ordering an appetizer to share and encouraging me to choose whatever I wanted from the menu. Hunger overrode my embarrassment as the food arrived. I tried to eat slowly, to remember my manners, but it had been so long since I'd had a proper meal. Uncle Lawrence noticed, I could tell, but he filled the silence with easy conversation, updates about his technology consulting business, stories about his wife Grace and their daughter Sophia, now a teenager. He carefully avoided asking about my father or stepfamily, focusing instead on neutral topics. So what are you doing these days? He finally asked as I finished my pasta. I had prepared for this, my cover story well rehearsed. I'm working at Sunrise Diner and taking some time to figure out my next steps, I said, the half-truth easier than a complete lie. Saving up, you know? 2 jobs must keep you busy, he remarked casually. I froze with my water glass halfway to my lips. How did you know I have 2 jobs? Your hands, he said gently. You have calluses from carrying trays, but also the distinct smell of convenience store cleaner. I recognize it because we represent a chain of them. I set down my glass, suddenly feeling exposed. I'm doing fine, I said defensively. Lots of people work multiple jobs. Of course, he agreed, then asked if I wanted dessert. When I hesitated, he ordered tiramisu and a slice of chocolate cake to go, insisting I take home the considerable leftovers from our meal as well. As the waiter packaged everything, Uncle Lawrence leaned forward. Amber, I've missed having you in my life. After your mother died, things got complicated. I tried to stay in touch, but Diane made it difficult, I finished for him. He nodded. I should have tried harder. I'm sorry. His sincerity caught me off guard. I'd grown so accustomed to manipulation that genuine concern felt almost foreign. When we left the restaurant, I thanked him awkwardly and turned toward my car, hoping he would drive away first. Instead, he followed me, watching as I carefully placed the leftover containers on my passenger seat, unable to miss the pillow I hadn't fully hidden. Where are you living now, Amber? He asked directly. I have a place, I said vaguely, not meeting his eyes. Is your place this car? The question hung in the air between us. I could feel my carefully constructed facade crumbling, shame and pride warring within me. I'm fine, I insisted, my voice cracking. I'm handling it. You're living in your car. It wasn't a question this time. Something in me broke. Maybe it was the kindness in his voice, or the exhaustion of maintaining appearances for so long, or simply having someone from my past, someone who knew me before I became this shadow version of myself, see through my pretenses. It's temporary, I said, tears finally spilling over. I'm saving for an apartment. I just need a few more months. Uncle Lawrence's face reflected shock, then deep concern. How long have you been living like this? 3 months, I admitted, the dam now broken. I left after they took my college fund. I couldn't stay there anymore, Uncle Lawrence. I couldn't. In halting sentences that gradually became a torrent, I told him everything, Diane's psychological warfare, Trevor's financial abuse, the systematic way they had isolated and controlled me, and finally, my father's ultimatum that had driven me to choose homelessness over continued abuse. Uncle Lawrence listened without interruption, his expression growing more pained with each revelation. When I finished, he ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair, visibly processing what I'd shared. "I had no idea it was that bad," he said finally. "I knew Diane was difficult, but this..." He seemed to make a decision. "Amber, I have a guest house. It's yours if you want it. No strings attached." Pride made me start to refuse. "I can't take charity. I'll be okay." "It's not charity," he cut in firmly. "It's family. Your mother would never forgive me if I left you living in a car when I have more space than I need." "I'd pay rent," I insisted, unwilling to become dependent on anyone again. "We can discuss terms later," he conceded. "For tonight, would you at least consider a proper bed and a hot shower?" The thought of a real bed after months of sleeping reclined in a driver's seat was almost too much to contemplate. Still, I hesitated. "What about Grace and Sophia?" "They don't even know me." "Grace has been asking about you for years," he said simply. "She'd love to meet you. And Sophia could use someone besides her boring parents around." The rain had started again, pattering against the roof of my car. The prospect of another night trying to sleep through the storm, worried about security knocking on my window, was suddenly unbearable compared to the alternative he offered. "Just for tonight," I agreed finally. The relief in his eyes was unmistakable as he said, "Follow me home, then. It's about 20 minutes from here." As I started my car to follow his Mercedes, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Embarrassment at being discovered, relief at finally telling someone the truth, and a tentative, unfamiliar feeling that took me a moment to identify: hope. Uncle Lawrence's guest house turned out to be what most people would call a luxury apartment. Attached to the main house but with its own entrance, it featured a spacious bedroom, full bathroom with a shower that had actual water pressure, a kitchenette, and a living area with a couch that probably cost more than everything I owned combined. "It's just temporary," I repeated as he showed me around, as much to convince myself as him. "And I'm paying rent." "We'll figure something out," he said, opening the refrigerator to reveal it was already stocked with basics. "Grace went shopping when I called to tell her you were coming." The gesture was so thoughtful it almost undid me again. "You didn't have to do that." "We wanted to," he said simply. "The towels are fresh, there's shampoo and whatever else you might need in the bathroom. Just make yourself at home." After he left me alone, I stood in the middle of the guest house, overwhelmed by the sudden change in my circumstances. Part of me wanted to flee back to my car, back to the struggle I understood, rather than accept help I wasn't sure I deserved. But exhaustion won out. I took a shower so long and hot that it would have cost me a week's worth of quarters at the laundromat shower, put on clean clothes from my backpack, and fell into the bed. I slept for 14 hours straight, the first uninterrupted sleep I'd had in months, without fear of someone knocking on my window or the need to stay alert for potential danger. When I woke, disoriented and panicked that I'd missed my shift at the diner, it took several moments to remember where I was. A note had been slipped under my door: "Whenever you wake up, come to the main house for breakfast. No rush. L." I checked my phone and was horrified to see it was nearly noon. I called both my jobs, creating an emergency involving a fictional relative to explain my absence. Doris at the diner was understanding, but Greg at Quickstop was less forgiving, warning that another no-show would mean termination. When I finally made my way to the main house, I found Uncle Lawrence's wife Grace in the kitchen. She had a warm, open face and immediately put me at ease, serving me eggs and toast without making a big deal about how hungrily I ate. "Lawrence told me a little about your situation," she said carefully. "I want you to know you're welcome here for as long as you need." "It's temporary," I said automatically. "And I insist on paying rent and helping around the house." She exchanged a look with Uncle Lawrence, who had joined us. "We'll work something out," she agreed. "But for now, why don't you take a few days to rest?" You look exhausted, honey. I started to protest that I couldn't miss more work, but Uncle Lawrence interrupted gently. Amber, I've been thinking. What if you cut back to just one job? It would give you time to focus on what you really want to do next. The suggestion sent a wave of anxiety through me. I can't afford to cut back. I need to save for an apartment. You have an apartment now, Grace pointed out. And we're not going to charge you market rate, for goodness sake. I don't want to be dependent on anyone, I said, the words coming out sharper than intended. Uncle Lawrence's expression softened with understanding. Independence is important. I respect that. But there's a difference between independence and isolation, Amber. Everyone needs support sometimes. His words hit uncomfortably close to home. I had been so focused on escaping dependency that I'd isolated myself completely. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. I continued working both jobs despite their encouragement to cut back, leaving early and returning late. I insisted on paying $400 monthly rent, far below market value but the most I could afford while still saving. I kept to myself, politely declining Grace's dinner invitations most nights, eating quickly in the guest house instead. Uncle Lawrence respected my boundaries but found small ways to help. He casually mentioned a credit repair specialist who had helped one of his employees, just in case you're interested. He left financial advice books on the guesthouse counter, something to read if you're bored. He offered to look at my car when the check engine light came on. I used to work on cars in college. A week into my stay, I met their daughter Sophia, a bright 16-year-old who shared her father's intelligence and her mother's warmth. Unlike her parents, she didn't tiptoe around my situation. Dad says you've been living in your car because your stepmom is basically the evil queen from Snow White, she said when we first met, earning a shocked Sophia from Grace. Her directness was strangely refreshing after months of hiding the truth. Pretty much, I admitted, surprising myself with a small laugh. That sucks, she said simply. Want to watch a movie? I made popcorn. Sophia became an unexpected bridge between me and her parents. It was easier somehow to accept an invitation from her than from them. Movie nights with Sophia gradually expanded to include her parents. One movie night became a weekly tradition, then expanded to Sunday family dinners. Still, I maintained my grueling work schedule, determined to build my savings and prove I wasn't taking advantage of their generosity. I was exhausted all the time, but it was a different kind of tired than before, not the bone-deep weariness of survival, but the ordinary fatigue of working too much. About a month after I moved in, Uncle Lawrence approached me with a proposal. I've been thinking about your situation with Trevor and the identity theft, he said carefully. I know someone who specializes in clearing credit histories after fraud. Would you be willing to meet with him? My immediate instinct was to refuse. Addressing the identity theft meant confronting the past I was trying to escape. But practical considerations won out. I couldn't move forward with my credit in shambles. I'll think about it, I said, which was more openness than I'd shown previously. Later that week, Uncle Lawrence suggested I consider reducing my hours at one job to take some online courses. You're smart, Amber. Your mother always said you were the brightest kid she'd ever met. It seems a waste for you to be spending all your time serving coffee and selling lottery tickets. Not everyone gets to follow their dreams, I said, the bitterness in my voice surprising even me. No, he agreed. But more people could if they had support. Your mother would have wanted that for you. The mention of my mother always disarmed me. I don't even know what I want to do anymore, I admitted. For so long, it's just been about surviving. That's okay, he said. You have time to figure it out now. Grace began suggesting I talk to someone professional about what I'd been through. Trauma doesn't just disappear because you're safe now, she said one evening after I'd woken from a nightmare, screaming loud enough to alarm them. I rejected the idea immediately. I'm fine. I don't need therapy. Everyone needs help processing difficult experiences, she persisted gently. I've been seeing someone myself for years. This surprised me. Grace seemed so put together, so perfectly adjusted. You have? She nodded. Anxiety and depression run in my family. Therapy isn't a sign of weakness, Amber. It's a tool, like any other. I didn't agree to therapy then, but the seed was planted. As weeks passed and the constant fear of being forced back to my car receded, other emotions began to surface: anger, grief, confusion about my father's betrayal. Sometimes these feelings would overwhelm me at unexpected moments, leaving me gasping for breath or fighting tears. During one such episode, Sophia found me sitting on the floor of the guest house bathroom, trying to control my breathing. Instead of getting her parents, she simply sat down beside me, shoulder to shoulder against the bathtub. When I have panic attacks, it helps if someone counts breaths with me, she said matter-of-factly. Want to try? I nodded, unable to speak, and she began counting slowly. In, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3. Out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We sat there for nearly an hour, just breathing together, until the vice around my chest loosened. Later, I learned she had struggled with anxiety after a bullying incident at her previous school. How do you handle it? I asked her. Therapy, she said simply. And knowing it's okay not to be okay sometimes. That night, I told Grace I was ready to try therapy if she could recommend someone. The relief and pride in her eyes made me realize how much they had come to care about me in such a short time. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to lower my defenses. I reduced my hours at Quickstop to take an online business course. I agreed to meet with the credit specialist Uncle Lawrence had suggested. I started therapy with Dr. Martin, a kind but no-nonsense woman who specialized in family trauma. I still insisted on my independence, still paid rent, still sometimes retreated to the guest house when family intimacy felt overwhelming. But I was beginning to understand what Uncle Lawrence had meant about the difference between independence and isolation. For the first time since leaving my father's house, I wasn't completely alone. I was just starting to believe this new stability might last when the past came crashing back into my life. The morning everything changed started normally enough. Uncle Lawrence had suggested we meet for coffee near his office to discuss some ideas he had about my business course project. I arrived early at the upscale cafe, feeling almost like a normal person in clean clothes with a laptop, not a homeless waitress hiding from her past. I was so focused on organizing my notes that I didn't notice someone approaching until a familiar voice said, "Well, look who it is." My blood went cold as I looked up to see Trevor standing there, expensive watch on his wrist and smirk on his face. Of all the coffee shops in the city, he had to walk into this one. "Trevor," I managed, my voice barely audible. His eyes flicked to my laptop, my clothes, the half-eaten pastry on my plate. "Interesting. Dad and Mom said you'd run off to live like a vagrant, but you look pretty comfortable to me." Before I could respond, Uncle Lawrence arrived, setting a protective hand on my shoulder. "Trevor," he said, his normally warm voice cool. "It's been a long time." Trevor's expression shifted from smug to calculated. "Uncle Lawrence. I didn't realize you two were in touch." "We reconnected recently," Uncle Lawrence replied neutrally. Trevor nodded slowly, already pulling out his phone. "Interesting. Very interesting. Dad will want to hear about this." After he left, I sat frozen, a panic attack building. Uncle Lawrence guided me through breathing exercises until I could speak again. "They're going to come after me," I whispered. "They'll say I lied, that I manipulated you, that I'm trying to turn you against them for money." "Let them try," Uncle Lawrence said with uncharacteristic hardness. "I'm not the naive brother-in-law they pushed aside 8 years ago." But his confidence did little to ease my fear. By the time we returned to the house, I was physically ill with anxiety, my body remembering years of emotional manipulation and gaslighting. I retreated to the guest house, packing my meager belongings automatically, preparing to run again. Grace found me frantically stuffing clothes into my backpack. "Amber, what are you doing?" "I have to leave," I said, not pausing in my packing. "I'm putting your family in danger." They'll come here, they'll cause problems for you. Slow down, she said firmly, taking the backpack from my hands. Talk to me. What happened? Through scattered sentences, I explained the encounter with Trevor. Grace listened carefully, then said, "So your stepbrother saw you and might tell your father where you are. That's not a reason to disappear." "You don't understand how they operate," I insisted. "Diane will find a way to twist this, to make me the villain. She always does." "Then we'll face that together," Grace said. "Running solved nothing last time, did it?" Her question stopped me short. No, running hadn't solved anything. It had just postponed the inevitable confrontation, while forcing me to live in my car for 3 months. Still, when the doorbell rang less than 2 hours later, the surge of adrenaline nearly made me vomit. Uncle Lawrence answered the door, and I heard the voices I'd hoped never to hear again, my father, Diane, Trevor, and Megan, all talking over each other as they pushed their way into the foyer. Grace found me hiding in the bathroom. "They're asking to see you," she said gently. "Lawrence is handling them, but eventually you'll need to face them. You don't have to do it alone, though." With her hand steady on my back, I finally entered the living room where my former family waited. My father looked older, more haggard than I remembered. Diane was as perfectly put together as always, her concerned expression practiced. Trevor leaned against the wall with false casualness, while Megan perched on the couch, examining her manicure with studied indifference. "Amber," my father said, half rising when he saw me. "We've been worried sick." The absurdity of this statement after 8 months of no contact almost made me laugh. "I find that hard to believe." Diane immediately adopted her hurt expression. "Of course we've been worried. You disappeared without a word. We thought you might be dead." "I left a note," I said flatly. "And Trevor has been using my identity for years. If you really wanted to find me, you could have checked the credit card statements." Trevor straightened, defensive. "That was a misunderstanding." "Fraud, actually," Uncle Lawrence interrupted coolly. "Which we're in the process of documenting for the authorities." A flash of genuine fear crossed Trevor's face before he controlled it. Diane stepped forward, arms outstretched as if for a hug I had no intention of giving. "Sweetheart, whatever you think happened, we can work through it as a family," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Your father and I just want you to come home where you belong." "I'm not going anywhere with you," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "I'm staying here." My father frowned. "You're living with Lawrence? For how long? Why didn't you call us if you needed help?" The genuine confusion in his voice suggested he truly didn't understand the depth of what had happened, or had been so thoroughly manipulated that he couldn't see it. "Why would I call the people who drove me out?" I asked. "Who took my college fund, destroyed my credit, and told me to accept my place or leave?" "That's not how it happened," Diane interjected quickly. "Richard, she's twisting things again, just like I told you she would." "I'm not twisting anything," I said firmly. "For the first time, I'm telling the truth without fear of retaliation." Megan finally looked up from her nails. "So dramatic. Always playing the victim." "That's enough," Uncle Lawrence said sharply. "Amber is welcome in our home for as long as she wishes to stay. She's an adult making her own decisions." "After you've obviously poisoned her against us," Diane accused. "What have you been telling her, Lawrence? That we're terrible people? That she should cut ties with her own father?" "He didn't have to tell me anything," I said. "I lived it. For 8 years after Mom died, I lived with your manipulation, your favoritism, your gaslighting." "Those are some fancy therapy words," Trevor sneered. "Did Uncle Lawrence pay for that too?" "I did," Grace spoke up from beside me. "Because Amber deserves to heal from what she experienced in your home." My father looked bewildered, glancing between Diane and me as if trying to reconcile 2 completely different realities. "Amber, if you felt this way, why didn't you ever say anything?" "I tried," I said, my voice breaking. "So many times, Dad. But you never listened." You always took her side. Because she was lying to you, Diane cut in desperately. She's always been troubled, Richard, you know that. Ever since her mother died. Don't you dare bring my mother into this, I said, anger finally overtaking fear. Don't you dare use her to manipulate him again. The room fell silent. My father stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, shock, confusion, maybe the first glimmer of doubt. Uncle Lawrence stepped forward. I think it's time for you all to leave. Amber has made her position clear, and as she's an adult, that should be the end of it. This isn't over, Diane said, her mask slipping to reveal the coldness beneath. Family business should stay in the family, Lawrence. You're overstepping. Amber is my family, he replied simply. She always has been. As they prepared to leave, my father hung back, attempting to speak to me privately. Amber, I don't understand what's happening, but if you need anything. I needed my father, I said quietly. For 8 years, I needed my father to see what was happening under his own roof. It's too late now. The pain in his eyes might once have weakened my resolve, made me doubt myself and apologize to keep the peace. But therapy had helped me recognize that his pain, while real, didn't invalidate mine. After they left, I collapsed onto the couch, shaking with delayed reaction. Sophia, who had been asked to stay in her room during the confrontation, came running down as soon as the door closed. Are you okay? She asked, sitting beside me. I could hear yelling. Not really, I admitted. But I will be. Uncle Lawrence sat across from me, his expression serious. They won't give up easily, Amber. Especially now that they know you're with us. I know, I said, the weight of that knowledge heavy on my shoulders. But neither will we, Grace added firmly. You're not alone in this anymore. That night, unable to sleep, I stood at the window of the guest house staring out at the peaceful garden. For the first time, I allowed myself to truly feel the anger I'd suppressed for so long, not just at Diane and her children, but at my father for his blindness, and at myself for enduring it for so long. But alongside the anger was something unexpected, strength. I had faced my abusers and stood my ground. I hadn't run, hadn't crumbled, hadn't reverted to the cowed, apologetic person I'd been trained to be. They knew where I was now, and the confrontation I'd feared for months had finally happened. Whatever came next, I would face it with allies beside me, not alone in my car with nowhere to turn. It wasn't over, Diane's parting words made that clear. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what would come next. 2 weeks after the confrontation at Uncle Lawrence's house, I sat across from private investigator Mitch Donovan in his modest downtown office. Uncle Lawrence had suggested hiring him to document the extent of the financial abuse I'd suffered, despite my initial reluctance. Financial abuse leaves a paper trail, Mitch explained, reviewing the documents I'd brought. Credit card applications, bank transfers, tax returns, it's all documented somewhere. I watched nervously as he examined the photographs I'd taken of bank statements the night I discovered my college fund had been emptied. These are a good start, but we need more. With your permission, I'll request your full credit report and banking history. Over the next month, Mitch methodically built a case that stunned even me with its thoroughness. Trevor hadn't just opened a few credit cards in my name, he'd taken out personal loans, opened multiple store accounts, even attempted to secure a mortgage using my information. The total fraud amounted to over $35,000. Most identity theft victims know their perpetrators, Mitch explained. But they rarely have the evidence or support to pursue justice. You're fortunate to have your uncle's backing. Fortunate wasn't a word I'd associated with myself in years, but I was beginning to see his point. The investigation also uncovered something I hadn't known. Uncle Lawrence had been sending birthday and Christmas checks to me for years after our contact was cut off. I'd never received a single one. According to bank records, they'd all been deposited into an account with my name but a signature that clearly wasn't mine. Diane intercepted your mail, Uncle Lawrence said grimly when we discussed the findings. I always wondered why you never acknowledged anything I sent. I thought you'd forgotten about me, I admitted. That you'd given up trying. his eyes filled with regret. Never. I should have tried harder, found another way to reach you. Along with Mitch's investigation, I had begun working with a therapist specializing in family trauma. Dr. Martin helped me understand the patterns of abuse I'd experienced and my responses to them. What you're describing is classic gaslighting, she explained during one session. They systematically made you question your own perceptions until you doubted your ability to trust yourself. I still do sometimes, I confessed. Even with evidence in front of me, I wonder if I'm exaggerating, if it was really as bad as I remember. That's the insidious nature of psychological abuse, she said. It doesn't leave visible bruises, but the damage is just as real. The therapy sessions were grueling, often leaving me emotionally drained afterward. I began having vivid nightmares and flashbacks to particularly painful incidents. Diane accidentally destroying a photo. The legal proceedings began with a formality that belied their emotional weight. Detective Rodriguez called to inform me that based on the evidence we'd provided, the district attorney had decided to pursue criminal charges against Trevor for identity theft, fraud, and financial exploitation. We'll need you to testify, he explained. Your statement will be crucial to the case. Simultaneously, our civil attorney Samantha filed suit against Trevor, Diane, and to my conflicted regret, my father as well. The suit sought restitution for the stolen college fund, damages for the credit fraud, and compensation for the emotional distress their actions had caused. Your father was legally responsible for the misappropriation of the college fund, Samantha explained when I hesitated to include him. And as the homeowner and your parent, he bears some liability for the abuse that occurred under his roof. The weeks that followed were a blur of depositions, evidence reviews, and preparation sessions. Uncle Lawrence accompanied me to every meeting, his steady presence a reminder that I wasn't facing this alone. Grace handled the practical aspects, ensuring I ate properly, reminding me of therapy appointments, creating a peaceful environment in the guest house where I could decompress after particularly difficult days. Sophia, in her direct teenage way, provided levity when the process became overwhelming. Maybe Trevor will look good in an orange jumpsuit, she suggested one evening when I was particularly stressed about the upcoming preliminary hearing. Despite the support, the legal process was grueling. Reliving the abuse in clinical detail for lawyers and investigators reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. Dr. Martin increased our sessions to twice weekly, helping me develop coping mechanisms for the anxiety and flashbacks that intensified as the court dates approached. A month into the proceedings, as we prepared for Trevor's arraignment on the criminal charges, I received a text message from my father asking to meet again. Hope flickered briefly that he had processed our previous conversation and was ready to acknowledge the truth. We met at the same coffee shop, but immediately I sensed something had changed. He seemed nervous, avoiding eye contact, his fingers drumming restlessly on the table. I've been thinking about everything, he began hesitantly. About what you told me, about the evidence Lawrence has gathered. And? I prompted when he paused too long. And I believe that you believe what you're saying, he said carefully. But Amber, families are complicated. Memories are subjective. Maybe things happened differently than you remember. The hope I'd harbored collapsed instantly. My memories are supported by documentation, I reminded him coldly. Bank records don't lie, even if people do. He sighed heavily. Diane has explained some of that. The college fund, she says we discussed using it for household expenses since you were living at home as an adult. She admits it was poorly handled, but not malicious. And Trevor using my identity for credit cards and loans? Was that poorly handled too? I asked, anger rising. Trevor made mistakes, my father conceded. Serious ones. But he's getting help now, seeing a therapist for his issues with money. Criminal charges would destroy his future. I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. What about my future? The one that was destroyed when he ruined my credit? When you and Diane took the money my mother left for my education? He had the grace to look ashamed, but pressed on. That's why I wanted to talk to you. We're prepared to make financial amends, pay back the college fund, help clear up the credit issues. But in return, we'd like you to drop the criminal charges and civil suit. The criminal charges aren't mine to drop, I pointed out. The district attorney decides that. It's out of my hands. But you could tell them you don't want to pursue it, he insisted. That you've reached a private agreement. Without your testimony, they'd likely drop the case. I felt sick as I realized what was happening. You're asking me to help Trevor avoid consequences for crimes he committed against me. I'm asking you to consider what's best for everyone, he countered. A long court battle will be painful for all involved. This way, you get financial restitution without the trauma of testifying. And Diane and Trevor get to avoid public accountability, I finished for him. Their reputations remain intact while mine gets dragged through the mud as the ungrateful daughter making trouble. He didn't deny it, which told me everything I needed to know. Have you even considered what's best for me in all this? I asked, already knowing the answer. I'm trying to find a solution that works for everyone, he said, avoiding the question. No, I said, rising from my seat. You're trying to protect them, just like you always have. Nothing has changed. Amber, please, he reached for my arm, but I pulled away. I'll see you in court, Dad. I left the coffee shop shaking with anger and betrayal. I'd given him a chance to choose differently, to finally stand with me instead of them, and he'd failed the test completely. The full extent of the betrayal became clear 2 days later when Samantha called me, her voice tight with controlled anger. We need to meet immediately. Your father has made a public statement about the case. In her office, she showed me a local news website where my father had given an interview characterizing me as mentally unstable and ungrateful, claiming I had invented accusations against my loving family because I resented my stepmother. He described Trevor as a troubled young man who made mistakes but didn't deserve criminal punishment, and portrayed himself and Diane as parents trying to help their difficult children through family conflict. He's trying to poison the well, Samantha explained grimly. Create public sympathy for them and doubt about you before the cases really get going. I sat stunned, reading his words over and over. Even knowing his pattern of choosing Diane over me, I hadn't expected such a public betrayal. What does this mean for our case? I finally asked. It makes things harder, but not impossible, she said. His statement contains several demonstrably false claims that actually help us establish a pattern of enabling abuse. Uncle Lawrence was livid when he learned what had happened. I knew Richard had become weak, but I never thought he'd stoop this low, he said, pacing Samantha's office. Using the media to attack his own daughter. It's actually consistent with the pattern of abuse, Dr. Martin pointed out when I discussed it in our next session. When abusers feel threatened by exposure, they often launch preemptive attacks on the victim's credibility. The public statement had one unexpected consequence: it brought forward unlikely allies. Our housekeeper from years ago, Mrs. Flores, contacted Samantha after seeing the news. She had witnessed Diane's treatment of me firsthand and was willing to testify. Following her example, our former gardener and a tutor I'd had in high school also came forward with corroborating accounts of the differential treatment and emotional abuse they'd observed. People saw what was happening, I realized during a strategy meeting with Samantha. They knew, and no one said anything. It's unfortunately common, she explained gently. People are reluctant to intervene in what they see as family matters. But they're willing to speak up now, when you've taken the first step. The criminal case against Trevor proceeded despite my father's attempts to discredit me. The evidence of fraud was simply too overwhelming to dismiss. As the first court date approached, media attention intensified, partly due to my father's statement and partly due to the substantial nature of the charges. I dreaded the public exposure, the thought of strangers reading about the most painful chapter of my life. Grace suggested I stay off social media and news sites, focusing instead on preparation with Samantha and self-care between legal appointments. The morning of Trevor's arraignment, I stood before the mirror in the guest house bathroom, hardly recognizing the confident woman staring back at me. 6 months earlier, I had been living in my car, shattered by abuse and betrayal. Now I was facing my abusers in court, supported by a family who chose me when my own had not. At the courthouse, I was surprised to see my father and Diane arrive separately, a visible distance between them as they took seats on opposite sides of the courtroom. Trevor looked smaller somehow, his typical arrogance dimmed by the reality of his situation as he stood before the judge. The proceedings were brief but significant. Trevor entered a not guilty plea despite the mountain of evidence against him. Watching him deny responsibility even now, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't about revenge or even justice anymore, it was about truth. My truth, finally being heard and acknowledged in an official capacity. As we left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions that I had been coached not to answer. But one caught my attention. "Mr. Hayes, why are you sitting separately from your wife today?" My father's uncomfortable expression suggested there might be more happening behind the scenes than I knew. 2 days later, Samantha called with unexpected news. "We've been approached about settlement negotiations for the civil case," she explained. "Their lawyer indicates they want to avoid a full trial." "Why now?" I asked, suspicious after everything that had happened. "Several factors likely contributed," she said. "The strength of our evidence, the corroborating witnesses who've come forward, and..." She hesitated. "There are rumors that your father and Diane are having marital problems. A public trial exposing their family dynamics would be particularly problematic under those circumstances." The settlement negotiations were tense and protracted. Diane initially offered an insulting sum coupled with a demand that I sign a non-disclosure agreement. Through Samantha, I refused outright and countered with terms that included full restitution of the college fund with interest, compensation for the credit damage, and no confidentiality provisions. "I won't be silenced as part of any agreement," I insisted. "The truth deserves to be told." After weeks of back and forth, we reached a compromise. They would pay substantial financial restitution, acknowledge in writing that the funds had been misappropriated, and assist in clearing my credit record. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue additional civil claims against them, though the criminal case against Trevor would proceed independently. The settlement brought mixed emotions. On one hand, it represented accountability and acknowledgement of the harm done to me. On the other, it felt somehow incomplete, a practical resolution without the emotional closure I had hoped for. Legal remedies rarely provide complete emotional satisfaction, Dr. Martin reminded me. That's not their purpose. The validation and practical remedies are valuable, but healing happens separately from legal outcomes. She was right, of course. The settlement provided resources to rebuild my life, but the deeper work of processing the betrayal and abuse would continue long after the legal documents were signed. As I signed the final settlement papers in Samantha's office, Uncle Lawrence beside me for support, I felt a complex mixture of relief, vindication, and lingering sadness for the family relationships that would never be repaired. The chapter wasn't closing as neatly as I might have wished, but it was closing nonetheless, making space for whatever came next. "You've shown remarkable courage throughout this process," Samantha told me as we shook hands. "Many victims never get this far." "I couldn't have done it without support," I acknowledged, glancing at Uncle Lawrence. "You did the hard part yourself," he countered. "We just provided a safe place for you to stand while you did it." As we left the lawyer's office, I stepped into the sunlight feeling lighter than I had in years. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it was truly mine to choose. 6 months after the settlement, my life had transformed in ways I could never have imagined while living in my car. I stood in the center of my own apartment, modest but comfortable, with a small balcony overlooking a park, and marveled at how far I'd come. With the settlement money, I had secured stable housing, purchased a reliable used car, and enrolled in business courses at the local community college. My credit was slowly being restored as the fraudulent accounts were removed from my record. I still worked part-time at the diner, not out of necessity now but because I enjoyed the routine and the honest work. My relationship with Uncle Lawrence's family had evolved from cautious gratitude to genuine connection. Sunday dinners at their home remained a highlight of my week. Sophia, now applying to colleges herself, often asked for my input on her application essays. Grace had become the maternal figure I'd been missing since my mother's death, offering advice when asked but always respecting my independence. Therapy with Dr. Martin continued, though we had reduced the frequency to once a week. The nightmares had largely subsided, and I was learning to recognize and counter the thought patterns instilled by years of gaslighting. I still had difficult days, still struggled with trusting others and myself, but the overall trajectory was undeniably positive. Trevor's criminal case had concluded with a plea deal. He avoided jail time but received 3 years of probation, mandatory financial counseling, and community service. The outcome wasn't the strict justice I might once have wanted, but I had made peace with it. His criminal record would follow him, a permanent consequence for actions he had long escaped accountability for. I had no contact with Diane, and limited information suggested she and my father were separated, though not yet divorced. The family unit they had so carefully constructed, often at my expense, was fracturing under the weight of exposed truths. My father had sent a letter a month after the settlement was finalized. In careful handwriting, he had expressed regret for his failures as a parent, acknowledged that he had enabled the abuse through his inaction, and asked if reconciliation might someday be possible. I kept the letter but hadn't yet decided whether to respond. Dr. Martin assured me that the decision was entirely mine, to make in my own time, if ever. On this particular morning, as I prepared for my business management class, my phone rang with Uncle Lawrence's number. "Are you sitting down?" he asked when I answered, his tone uncharacteristically serious. "I am now," I said, sinking onto my couch. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he assured me quickly. "But I've been keeping something from you, and it's time you knew the truth." My stomach tightened with instinctive anxiety. "What truth?" "It's about your mother," he said. "Before she died, she set up a trust for you. I'm the executor." I struggled to process his words. "A trust? But I never knew about any trust." "That was by design," he explained. "She knew your college fund wasn't enough for what she wanted for you, so she created a separate trust with her life insurance money. It was structured to become available to you at 25, or earlier if certain conditions were met." "Why am I just hearing about this now?" I asked, mind reeling. "I turned 25 2 years ago." There was a heavy pause before he answered. "Because your father and Diane hid the existence of this trust from you. The notifications I sent as trustee when you turned 25 were intercepted, just like the checks and letters over the years." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. They knew? All this time, they knew there was money meant for me, and they kept it from me? "Yes," he confirmed grimly. "We discovered it during the investigation for your case. There's documentation showing attempts to access the trust illegally, using forged signatures and altered documents. They were unsuccessful because the trust has strict verification requirements, but they never told you it existed." "How much?" I began, then stopped, unsure if I even wanted to know. "Your mother was smarter than anyone gave her credit for," Uncle Lawrence said with gentle pride. "She invested in several tech startups I advised her on before they went public. The current value of the trust is just over $800,000. The room seemed to tilt around me. $800,000, I repeated numbly. While I was living in my car. "I'm so sorry, Amber," he said, regret heavy in his voice. "I should have found a way to reach you directly, to make sure you knew." "I failed you too." "No," I said firmly, finding my voice again. "You didn't know I wasn't receiving your communications. The only people who failed me were the ones who deliberately kept this from me." After the call ended, I sat motionless on my couch, processing the implications. My mother had protected me from beyond the grave, providing for my future in ways I hadn't known. Diane and my father had tried to prevent me from receiving that final gift, that lasting proof of my mother's love and foresight. The next day, I did something I hadn't planned. I drove to my father's house, not the family home where I'd grown up, but a small rental he'd moved to after separating from Diane. I hadn't told him I was coming, hadn't responded to his letter, but something in me needed this final confrontation. He opened the door looking older and diminished, surprise evident on his face. "Amber," he said, her name almost a question. "I know about the trust," I said without preamble. "Mom's trust that you and Diane hid from me." The color drained from his face, and he stepped back involuntarily. "How did you?" "Uncle Lawrence told me everything," I interrupted. "The notifications you intercepted, the attempts to access it fraudulently, all of it." He seemed to physically shrink before my eyes. "I can explain." "No," I cut him off. "I'm not here for explanations or excuses. I'm here to give you these." I handed him a thick envelope containing legal documents. "These are formal notices about the trust, which I now control. There are also restraining orders against Diane and Trevor, and a cease and desist letter regarding any public statements about me or my finances." He took the envelope with trembling hands. "Amber, please." "I have nothing more to say to you," I said calmly. "Whatever relationship we might have had is over. This is just formality." As I turned to leave, he called after me, "I never wanted to hurt you. I just got lost somewhere along the way." I paused at the door. "So did I," I replied without turning back. "The difference is, I found my way again." Walking away from that house for the final time, I felt no triumph, no vindication, just a quiet certainty that this chapter of my life was truly closing. Diane's mask dropped completely when served with the legal notices. She made a desperate attempt to contact me, leaving voicemails alternating between tearful pleas and venomous accusations. I never responded, letting her words disappear into the digital void. Trevor's reaction to the criminal charges was panic. He attempted to flee the state before his sentencing hearing, only to be caught at a bus station. His probation terms were consequently stricter, with electronic monitoring added to the original conditions. My father's realization of the full extent of manipulation seemed to finally break through his willful blindness. He sent a single text after our last meeting: "You deserved better. I'm sorry I failed you." I read it once, then blocked his number. The trust my mother had established became the foundation for an entirely new life. With financial security I had never imagined possible, I transferred from community college to a 4-year university, pursuing the business degree I had once thought beyond my reach. I moved to a more comfortable apartment closer to campus, though I kept my lifestyle relatively modest, the habits of frugality deeply ingrained after months of survival. More importantly, I established a foundation called Second Chance, dedicated to helping victims of domestic and financial abuse. We provided emergency housing assistance, legal advocacy, and financial literacy education for people escaping situations similar to mine. Uncle Lawrence joined the board of directors, bringing his business expertise and connections to expand our reach. The most meaningful work came from sharing my story. Initially hesitant to speak publicly about my experiences, I found unexpected purpose in helping others recognize patterns of abuse in their own lives. My first speaking engagement at a women's shelter was terrifying, my voice shaking as I described living in my car rather than remaining in an abusive home. But the connections formed that day, the recognition in the eyes of women who had faced similar impossible choices, convinced me that vulnerability could be a source of strength. One evening, while volunteering at a community outreach event, I noticed a young woman lingering near our information table. She kept glancing at our housing assistance flyers but would back away whenever anyone approached her. Something in her body language, the hypervigilance, the careful way she positioned herself with clear sightlines to all exits, was painfully familiar. "We have coffee and sandwiches in the back," I said casually, not looking directly at her. "No pressure to talk to anyone." She startled slightly, then nodded and followed me to the refreshment area. As she ate, too quickly, like someone accustomed to having food taken away, I noticed the car keys clutched tightly in her hand, the slightly rumpled appearance of someone without consistent access to laundry facilities. "My name is Amber," I offered when she'd finished eating. "Jess," she replied quietly. "Nice to meet you, Jess," I said, then added carefully, "if you need a safe place to park overnight, the church on Maple allows it." They have bathrooms accessible from the side entrance until 10 p.m. Her eyes widened with recognition and fear. How did you? I lived in my Honda for 3 months, I said simply. Walmart parking lots mostly, but they started cracking down with security patrols. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. Toyota Corolla, she said. Going on 2 weeks now. It gets harder in winter, I acknowledged. We have emergency housing vouchers if you're interested. No strings attached. She studied me with the wary assessment I recognized from my own mirror a year earlier. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. I smiled, thinking of Uncle Lawrence finding me that rainy night, offering help when I'd been too proud and afraid to accept it. Because someone helped me when I needed it. And because no one should have to live in their car to feel safe. By the end of the evening, Jess had accepted temporary housing assistance and an appointment with our legal advocate to discuss the restraining order she needed against an abusive partner. Driving home that night, I thought about the strange, painful journey that had brought me full circle, from victim to survivor to advocate, from receiving help to offering it. The trust my mother left was more than money, it was her final affirmation that I deserved better than what I had accepted for so long. Uncle Lawrence, Grace, and Sophia had become my chosen family, our bond strengthened through crisis and healing. Sunday dinners remained sacred, now hosted in my apartment as often as their home. Sophia called me for advice about college classes and relationship problems, treating me more like a sister than a cousin. Grace and I shared a love of gardening, spending peaceful weekends tending to the small container garden on my balcony. Dr. Martin had helped me recognize that family isn't always defined by blood or legal ties, but by consistent care and mutual respect. The people who had proven themselves trustworthy during my darkest moments were my true family, regardless of genetic connection. As I pulled into my apartment complex that night, I glanced at the passenger seat where my phone displayed a notification, a text from Jess thanking me for the housing assistance. A year ago, I had been in her position, desperate and alone. Now I had the stability and resources to offer others the second chance I'd been given. The circle of giving and receiving help, of falling and rising again, of losing family and finding it anew, this was the true inheritance my mother had left me, more valuable than any trust fund. In that moment, standing between my car and my home, I realized I had finally found the belonging and safety that had eluded me for so long. Not in my father's house, where love had been conditional and loyalty one-sided. Not in my car, where independence had meant isolation. But in the connections I had formed since then, with Uncle Lawrence and his family, with the people I helped through the foundation, with the person I was becoming. I was no longer defined by what had been done to me, but by what I chose to do with the life I had reclaimed. And that, perhaps, was the most surprising outcome of all, finding purpose in pain, strength in vulnerability, and family in the aftermath of betrayal. What about you? Have you ever had to completely rebuild your life after betrayal or hardship? Do you think blood family is always more important than chosen family? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if my story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to join me on this journey of healing and transformation. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest beginnings. Your past doesn't define your future, you do.